Now it should be on, yeah.
You might want to use that.
Yeah, yeah. Let me first start with saying something about religion, secularity, and development. The relation between religion and development is, I think, quite crucial from the 19th century onwards. The idea that we all should strive for progress, for change. As I already said, radical change is possible, and that is a positive thing. It's not a thing that should be repressed. So the idea that progress is an ultimate value is a 19th century idea, and a very strong 19th century idea. Now, how does religion relate to that idea of progress? There is a possibility to look at it as an obstacle, like Marx was doing, like many social scientists of the period were doing, or a stage, an element in a human evolution, which will soon be discarded. So the idea of progress is largely an idea of material progress. It's an understanding of the world in terms of a difference with the past that is positive and that can be measured in terms of material development. Now, what is this material development? I think the basic indicators, because you can endlessly talk about what progress means, but the basic indicators on which most people would agree is eradication of poverty and elimination or conquering of the world of disease. And by that measure, longevity, so longer, healthy life. The general idea in the 19th century is that, and that is an idea that continues to be the most important idea today, is that this is secular progress. It's not dependent on religion. It's dependent on science. And scientific progress will create material progress through technology and will also help in fighting disease. That's why most of the funding probably here at this university goes to the hospital. And if there is an engineering college, that would also be part of it. That would definitely be in Stanford. So this is secular and not dependent on what kind of belief people have. So what is then the role or the place, the location of religion? It becomes more and more a moral source of legitimation of social order and a moral source of higher purpose of human beings. That means that religion relinquishes its claim on knowledge in the scientific world. Here in America it's not entirely true, of course. There are still some little fights in the margins, but that doesn't really count. It's more or less the world of science. And as Talal Assad has once been arguing, or proposing, religion is an option, but science is not an option. Science determines our lives, and the technologies that are developed from science are shaping our lives in terms of electricity, the sound system, and so on. So that, in a general sense, implies that secular progress gives a certain place to religion, and that religion does not really give a place to science. Now, if that is the secular arrangement of modern society in Europe in the 19th century, and then also in the United States, that is heavily influenced by the European development, then we have to see how India and China relate to this general story of eradication of poverty, of the fighting of disease, and the place of religion as a moral source of legitimation of political order. Now, China, and I look at it, at China and India from a historical perspective. So you could say I'm of course an anthropologist by training, but an anthropologist who has become more and more a historical sociologist, or a comparative historical sociologist. The larger pattern that we see here is that in the Qing dynasty, say the several centuries before modern China, before the Republic in the 20th century, in the Qing dynasty, religion was part of the imperial rule. The ritual of the emperor, or the mandate of heaven, was what legitimized Qing rule all over China. All intellectual production was part of that, what you could call ancien regime. And at the apex of that system was the emperor. Now, that world had to change after the Opium Wars from the mid-19th century till the end of the 19th century. The several treaties that followed the Opium Wars, which were the wars that brought the imperial power, primarily Britain, but also the other powers, France and Germany and Japan, into China. The new situation after the Opium Wars was that the Chinese had to figure out how to catch up with these powerful imperial nations. So how to mobilize the strength of of society for catching up. The general way this was done in China, and the general tenor of intellectual debate was that China had to embrace modern science, or as it is called in Chinese, in China, Mr. Science. Mr. Science had to be embraced, and one had to discard one's own civilizational sources. There's a whole debate about that. It's quite complicated, but this is the general tenor. Religion in the Qing Empire was already part of a political order, and all organized religions had to be brought under the power also of the new state. So the new republic in the 20th century, and later the communist state, the main relation to religion is to control it. This is done in various ways. Mostly religions are organized on a Christian model. and with a hierarchy, with a certain kind of associational form, and brought under the power of the state. So religion was allowed, but under the control of the state, as it in fact had been in the Qing Empire. What was not allowed was the large set of practices that are called popular religion in China. Now, popular religion is almost everything, in fact, which is seen as not controllable. So there's a very interesting and complex relation between Buddhism and Taoism as official religions, so-called, and these popular practices. You have to realize that religions did not exist in China, and that to organize this whole field in terms of religion, like what you had to do in India, is a modern phenomenon, is a totally modern set of governmental practices. The word for religion does not exist. Zhongjiao comes from Japanese. It's just a translation from Western languages. So a whole set of conceptual and organizational practices had to come into place to give, to organize religion. Religion then, like in Europe, had to become a moral source for progress. So what all these intellectuals are doing is to say, well, Taoism and Buddhism, these are religions that are equal to Christianity and have equal possibility of being used for progress, for material progress in society. And you see all kinds of national forms of religion emerging. So the main Buddhist monks and Taoist monks are arguing about how religion can be a source for the progress of China. Because everyone agrees that the ascension of imperial power in the 19th century had shown that the old civilization was rotten. That there was something not right in China as it was, as it encountered the power of Western imperial power. Now that is a general story, of course, of imperialism in not only in China but in India and in the rest of the world. But there's a very radical way the Chinese are responding to this challenge. They respond very radically by saying, well, the people are stupid. The people are illiterate. They don't know what to do. They are superstitious. This is also a word which becomes very important in governmental practices from the end of the 19th century up to today. So superstitious practices have to be repressed, and because they are an obstacle to the eradication of poverty, the fighting of disease. That requires a very specific conceptual activity, namely the splitting of practices between magical practices and religious practices. So superstitious practices and religious practices. That's a really hard trick to do, because most of religion is superstition, obviously. Right? So it is not easy to say, well, this is actually can be a moral source for legitimation of political power. This can be helpful for the progress of China, and that particular practice is superstitious and is an obstacle. But that is what had to be done. And so you see also a whole internal debate, you may say, among monks and among lay intellectuals, who are concerned with Taoism and Buddhism, about what is the authentic core of their religion, what is the pure intellectual and rational content of their religion, and what is just stupid folk belief. We see these practices obviously everywhere, but they are taking a really stark form in China because they are backed by the state. So it's which was also true in medieval and early in Renaissance Europe. But here we have a modern state, a modern state that comes up. So more and more power comes behind this. It's not simply the Inquisition of some Miller in Italy. It is all over the place, and it's a total education and re-education of people. Now that distinction between magic and religion, as you know, was also a distinction made in theories of religion in Europe. Tyler, a number of evolutionary anthropologists, but up to Weber, of course, has directly to do with the idea of rationality and rationalization. It's a core element also in the Entzauberungs thesis of Weber. So it's not a kind of unusual thing that this is being debated in China, but it gets a very particular form, and then it gets the form of enormous destruction. Millions of temples are being destroyed in China. And that is long before the communist period. So that starts basically at the end of Qing, at the end of the Qing Empire. So the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. So the theory of progress and the relation between progress and religion gets this particular atheistic, radical secularist form. And it makes not much sense to speak about secularization of India and China. It makes a lot of sense to speak about secularism in these places. There are these projects of particular intellectuals and sometimes backed by politics of getting rid of religion. Now the story of India is of course very, very different from that of China. And that is not because, as some people have been always thinking, that India and China, so Hegel, from Hegel onwards, there's a big there are these assumptions about India and China as totally different. In China it is all state, in India it's all society, in Hegelian terms. So the rationality is repressed. The rationality of the individual is repressed in both cases, in India by the caste system and in China by the state. But indeed there is a very different development in India. And if you look at it in the same way as we have been looking at it in China, namely as a long-term development, say from the Qing to the imperial period, to the effects of imperial power, to the republic and then to communism, you can look at India from the Mughal period to British Empire, to the modern Republic of India and of Pakistan and Bangladesh, obviously, because these are, well, this is one cultural entity, and they are now divided by the vicissitudes of history, but they actually belong to each other. Now, the Mughal Empire never had any claim to make India Muslim. The Mughal Empire just wanted to rule, and could only rule by having alliances and forms of patronage of Hindu, what we call Hindu temples and Hindu orders and Hindu practices. And that's the larger part of the history. There are also some other parts, but this is the larger history. It's a history of basically of patronage. And when the British come into India, they take that over. So the company, the British East India Company, that is the main trading entity that deals with India till the mid-19th century, basically takes over this role of patronage, not only from the Mughal Empire but also from Hindu kings. Wherever they establish their power, they become patrons of Hindu religion. That is not seen in a positive light by evangelicals in Britain, and of course this creates some trouble. And so you have all these anti-idolatry movements which coincide with the anti-slavery agitations in early 19th century Britain. So you get opposition against the East Company acting as a patron of pagan, idolatrous practices. And what comes into place is a withdrawal from that patronage role into a neutral role. So the state, the colonial state, becomes more and more a neutral arbiter, a secular arbiter of practices in India. And it does so through trying to find out what the Hindus think, what the Muslims think, what the Sikhs think, and so on, trying to establish also the scriptural sources of what they think, because it has all to be based on some kind of evidence. So a whole canon of Islamic law and Hindu law is being established by the British to create a arbiter role for the state. Now this neutral role of, and you might say secular role of the state, which is developed through colonialism, is of course very different from what the Qing government and what the Republic in China was doing. And I think one of the main explanations of this is that the British are alien in India. They are not part of society. They don't want trouble. The trouble like the mutiny, for example, big rebellions. They just want to get profit and rule, which is very different than when you are involved and part of a society. So it's a real colonial neutrality. Now the colonial neutrality is taken over by the post-colonial state, because most of the laws, the legal framework, and most of the ways India is also administered is a colonial legacy. And in fact, if you think of it, Britain is a very small country. Of course, India was ruled by Indians under a British arrangement. And so these practices just continue after independence in the post-colonial state. So we have colonialism as one of the main differences between India and China. So there's of course imperial power having effects on China, but China has never been colonized, and that's really a crucial difference. Nationalism in India, of course, also wants progress, like nationalism in China. They also come to the conclusion that these Western people have superior power. and that is based on science, and that they have to get that. But they don't see, the Indian nationalists hardly ever see religion as an obstacle to that. And that's very, very interesting. It's completely the opposite with China. So there's not this sense that, there's obviously a sense that people have to be educated in India, but that there's not a sense that they have to get rid of their religion or their practices. Some practices have to be eradicated. So there are all these reform movements which try to make religion more rational. So, for example, the Arya Samaj in northern India, they try to rationalize Hindu religion. So there are forms of reformism, but there's very little atheistic secularism in India. And religion becomes the main element in nationalism. Now that can be explained not only by this fact of the colonial neutrality, but also by another major fact in India which is also different from China, namely the competition with Muslims, the Hindu-Muslim divide, and the growing antagonism and mobilization as nations, as in principle electoral forces from the 19th century onward, from the end of the 19th century onwards, between Hindus and Muslims. Which then in the end, as you know, ends up in the division of India in India, Pakistan and Bangladesh. So that mobilization around religion and also the enormous focus on creating a kind of Hindu majoritarianism is one of the major facts in India. And that Hindu majoritarianism is not an easy thing to pull off. First of all, it's like Confucianism, like Taoism, like Buddhism. These are all isms that have just developed in the 19th century. And Hinduism is very unclear as a so-called religion. This makes our work always very different. We have to constantly reflect on that problem of religion. Now, Hindu practices and organizations in different parts of India are very different, and moreover, there is a caste system that divides people. And large parts of the population are called untouchable and tribal. And these people really do not belong to Hinduism, but have to be brought into Hinduism to create a majoritarian Hinduism, to create a majority, an electoral majority in India. So you see that there are enormous effects of modern electoral politics on the formation of religion in India. Now let me come to the where I started, the eradication of poverty and the fighting of disease. So the development, what is accomplished and what is happening in China and India with this kind of history. In China, well, a major fact is, of course, since independence, the establishment of a communist rule. Now that communist rule is an interesting kind of thing. The communists are obviously atheists. They see religion as an opium of the people, and hook up with this older idea that the superstition of the masses has to be repressed and eradicated. But there is something in Chinese communism, which is Maoism, which looks very similar to religion, in fact. There's a kind of mobilization or a constant mobilization of the population for development goals in the 1950s and 1960s. And these mass campaigns look very much like millenarianism. And China has a larger history of challenges to the state of millenarian movements that goes deep into the Ming Dynasty. Communists mostly interpret this as peasant rebellions, with of course, a false ideology of a God coming back and so on. But basically these are, in fact, religious movements that challenge the legitimacy of the Qing, first of the Ming and the Qing dynasties, and also of potentially of the communist state. Now what Mao has done is transform these millenarian potential, which is still there very much. The Falun Gong is a very good example of it. It's very much in Chinese history. Summon or harness this energy, this potential in China for mobilization of the masses for his own purposes. So the Great Leap Forward, the Great Cultural Revolution have very strong millenarian elements, and have also culturally elements of anti-witchcraft. So what you see is that the state takes over some or adopts some elements that were previously anti-state, and have a strong religious character. But still, people have of course suffered very much under the Cultural Revolution, but you still can speak with a lot of people who went through that was a period of enthusiasm and of an idea that there was a utopia that could be attained. And a lack of utopia today, or a kind of complaint about the materialism of today and the kind of almost spirituality of the Maoist era. Now that is one element that I find interesting in what happened in this communist period. The other element, of course, is in terms of eradication of poverty and general material progress, is the revolutionary process, getting rid of what in China or in Marxist terms in general is called feudal structures. So getting rid of large land ownership, getting rid of a capitalist class, general transformation of land ownership, which immediately has affected, obviously, religion. Because religion, of course, has a material base. It needs land, it needs buildings, it needs schools. Well, everything was expropriated and the priests were re-educated. So basically the entire infrastructure of religion was destroyed in China. But with that also a lot of very unequal arrangements in society. So this is a general destruction, obviously, with an enormous toll of human life, but also a complete transformation of society. I think that has laid the basis for the current development of China. Not only the roads and so on, which are very important, but also the infrastructure, as it were, of human capital. In India, none of that has happened. Basically, as I said, the post-colonial state is a heir to the colonial state. It's basically taking over the structures of the colonial state. There is no destruction of the caste system in India. Caste is alive and kicking. It's very important in the electoral process. It's very important in land ownership. So it still continues to be of great importance. There's no equality. It's a deeply hierarchical society still. And that's not only in terms of status groups of caste, but also in terms of gender. That it has also been much more equalized in China. There are very strong caste attitudes towards poverty. And whereas in China, the Communist Revolution, of course, focuses on the common people and even glorifies the common people as the peasant, as the kind of model for the entire society. Poor people in India are seen as almost another nation. They are untouchable. They are actually not even worthy of care. So I wrote a paper on care arrangements in India. It's really remarkable how a lot of arrangements of hygiene, of social hygiene, and basic infrastructure of, garbage disposal and so on, are not in place, whereas they are in place in every modern society. And one of the reasons of that is that there is this huge distinction between what belongs to my family and caste in my society and what is outside. And the outside world is also the world of the untouchables. So you see that there are really very important consequences of the relation between religion and development. This is not a Weberian story or something. It's just an observation, an empirical observation of the enormous social energy that is focused on the transformation of religion in India and China. But there is nothing universal. There's no model that we can just use to understand the relation between religion, secularity, and progress or eradication of poverty. There are different kinds of histories that are relating to a universal story. There's no doubt that also for Indians and Chinese, the secular progress, secular economic and scientific progress have and also today form their lives, like it is the case for us. It's the case basically universally. But the ways this general pattern is interpreted and acted upon by human actors in India and China are very different depending on their historical pathway. Thank you.